Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, a series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is the Director of Research with the Bahá'í Community, and he has a background in electrical engineering, and his areas of interest and work have been in the spheres of human rights, poverty and development, the contemporary issues that our world and planet confront. I'm delighted to welcome Matthew Weinberg.
Great pleasure to be here.
Matthew, you have been working on the issue of poverty and development, and this seems to be sort of almost a fashionable part of development discourse in recent years, certainly since the World Bank decided that there may be a dimension to economic development beyond the purely mercenary. In what ways has the philosophy of the Baha'is, which you explore and work, looked at some of these issues?
We have, over the years, in different parts of the world, undertaken fairly modest projects where we have communities that have reached a certain critical mass and are capable of undertaking some endeavors that are designed to promote material advancement. And what we discovered was that the things that matter most are principles and processes. Goals are important and very practical strategies are important, but really it's, it is the overall attitude, the objective, the sense of purpose, the sense of unity, which defines successful development endeavor.
But and this process of cultivating the attitude, the process itself, to what degree is this able to be autonomous from the pressures, the imperatives of a globalized economy? These things aren't sort of always determined by communities themselves. They rarely have the freedom to do that.
Yeah. This is a great question of our time, self-determination. And really one of the characteristics of this age, Baha'is believe, is that for the first time in history, humankind has reached a stage of its development where we have the powers of maturation, where we are on the threshold of maturation. And what I mean by that is, if you look at human history, we have experienced conflict and misery of a considerable degree, unfortunately. And these are expressions, we believe, of our childhood and our adolescence. Adolescent behavior is really having the powers of an adult, but the emotions of a child.
Well, let's go back a little bit and sort of introduce us to the Baha'i view of the world. You just use the idea as to why are we here?
Yes.
What is our purpose? So in terms of the Baha'i view of the world, why are we here? What is our purpose?
Yes. We don't believe that we are chance products of a thermodynamic system, that we're here by accident. Yes, there are physical laws at work, but these laws are reflections of a divine source. So we understand ourselves to be a spiritual creation. We are spiritual beings. Yes, we are also material beings, but in essence, the material reality is suffused by a reality that is deeper, but is just as objective as the material reality that we see. The way that we know about this is that we believe that a creator, a single God who's the God of all humankind, has sent teachers or messengers throughout history to guide and cultivate the moral and intellectual capacities of the human race. Baha'is follow the teachings of Baha'u'llah, who appeared in the 19th century in Persia and brought a message of peace and oneness, that we are now at this stage of maturity that I indicated before, that we can come together and actually build structures and conditions of peace in the world.
What is its attitude to poverty? Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth. That has sort of been an idea that has been frequently used to legitimize, to justify poverty in some ways. How do the Baha'is view this?
At the base of Baha'i belief is the idea that mind and heart must go together, that science and religion are complementary tools to understand truth and reality, and they should work together. There's a very strong concept in the Baha'i teachings. Baha'u'llah talks about how each of us have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. In that context, and also Baha'u'llah speaks very much of justice. In that context, poverty is something that is to be overcome. It is not at all accepted. The traditional spiritual virtues or ethical ideas of humility and detachment from material things is the idea of detachment from things that keep us away from God, that turn us away from our spiritual nature, not that we should go live in a cave and reject the world. So we're very practical in our belief. And in that sense, our teachings tell us that we have to work for the advancement of society and do everything in our power to advance the condition of human beings. So uplifting the status of women, working for justice in a general sense of human rights, building patterns of living that really cultivate the potential of individuals.
But at some level, and up to what level is material striving seen as an obstacle to one's spiritual evolution? And given that it derives from a notion of divinity and God, what is its attitude and relationship to agnostic traditions such as Buddhism?
What Baha'u'llah indicates is that each of the great religious traditions of the world come from the same divine source. And
even so those that deny divinity.
So even though a system of belief such as Buddhism, which most of its followers would say is agnostic, we would regard the truths in that system of belief to be totally consistent with what we find in the teachings of Christianity, of Judaism, of Islam, and the Baha'i religion. And in fact, Baha'u'llah makes a claim that Buddha was in fact inspired by God. So as a matter of belief, we have a somewhat different understanding of the Buddha, but we have great respect for his teachings and the ethical principles that he brought.
You have been working as a focus of your interest and research on how the traditional principles and philosophies of the Baha'i faith apply to contemporary issues and situations. Looking at issues of such as the environment, for example,
Yes.
The struggle to evolve a global consensus, the problem again of equity between countries that have higher levels of consumption than others. There is an apparent consensus on what is right,
Yes.
in a sense. But the challenge really is that what are the mechanisms that communities, and particularly those who are shall we say, the deprived and the victims of inequity, what is it that they can do to redress this beyond appealing, perhaps say, to the conscience of the more developed world? So in real practical processes,
Yes.
What do you see are the real possibilities?
First of all, we have to admit that there's great inequity and injustice in the world. The vast majority of the world's peoples are living under material conditions that are quite appalling. And those of us who are in situations where we do have some measure of affluence have a particular responsibility, I think, to work towards the alleviation of those conditions. The problems are immense, they're complex, but speaking to the issue of processes is, I think, quite properly the right way to look at it. I think there is an emerging consensus, and one of the most important developments perhaps of the past few decades is the emergence of civil society, of the NGOs, of a greater voice for the grassroots of society in all parts of the world. And what this represents is really the articulation of identity, the articulation of voice, again, this self-determination. This is really the first step in instilling confidence that people can take control of their own destiny. And what we have found, and I think other religious communities working in the development field have found, is that when communities, when a village, for example, is able to develop certain basic skills of cooperation and interaction that analyze and address the problems that confront them, then once that mechanism starts, they're able to move forward in a very dramatic way. So ultimately the answer is self-reliance and building organizational capacity. But this is really, it's releasing capacity within individuals, connecting it with others to build organizational or institutional capacity, and then it's possible to move forward.
But we looked at the problem of the issue of the environment.
Yes.
We've been talking about it.
Yes.
But nothing has concretely happened.
Yes.
And we have a situation where the whole notion of energy and pollution audits and the richer nations are selling these off to developing countries such as ours. So while we see a discourse, certainly, but we really don't see a consensus, we don't really see action. Meanwhile, even as this discourse has taken place, the temperatures on Earth have already gone up significantly.
So there are great challenges before us, and there's great paralysis of will. And there are interests at work that are perhaps preventing action. I think that we need to know, for example, we need to look at some things that have happened that are positive. Say, for example, the ozone issue. The Montreal Protocol was extremely effective. We have essentially eliminated the question of CFCs. Granted, it was a sort of a single variable to focus on, and that perhaps was the reason why it was easy to focus on it and solve it. And it was easy to come up with alternatives and develop solutions to help countries around the world also incorporate those alternatives. The issue of climate change is much more complex. It's multidimensional. It goes to the very heart of how society uses technology and organizes itself. And it relates to what you had referred to before, the very use, the production and consumption of resources, what society does with its resources. And so there are all sorts of issues and possibilities for addressing these questions. And unfortunately, it seems that the human condition is such that until crisis appears, we're not able to really take the preventative steps. That being said, there's a lot of work being done and a lot of research. And the question with respect to climate change, for example, is really managing uncertainty, managing risk. What should we do? Clearly, I worked in the energy policy field. Clearly, the answer is to try to find win-win propositions. Promoting energy conservation and renewable energy is a clear winner. Even if all the predictions about global warming are wrong, which I seriously doubt, if we do that, if we follow an energy conservation, renewable energy path, then we're setting ourselves in the right direction regardless. So this is a question of policy for governments. Certain governments are doing good things in this respect, others are not. And the question is, what changes policy? And unfortunately, usually it's crisis. And the thing that is, of course, scary and challenging to us is that processes are in motion now, perhaps, that we'll discover are too late. And when we react, there will be serious difficulties that we're going to have to contend with. And that's likely.
You have been working in the area of human rights widely and have written extensively on the issue. And there are plainly sort of two divergent views that emerge on the question of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the universality of human rights, and to what degree these may or may not be culture specific, and a perception in many communities that this is a Western developed country's notion of human rights, which is being imposed on the others. What is your view?
I think there's no question that the idea of dignity, of the nobility of the human person, is found in all cultures. Some cultures may in fact not codify the idea of rights or have the notion of rights, but there is the idea of respect for the outsider or the stranger or the visitor to your home. In this particular part of the world, it's something that really strikes one. When you're the honored guest, you feel, my goodness, because I won't be able to return the same sort of treatment when you come to my place in the United States. This tells me that there's something endemic to cultures in all parts of the world. I've traveled widely. And research definitely indicates this. You find it in the religious traditions. There's a great Buddhist concept that the responsibility of kings is to ensure the rights of those under them, that they're a trust. And as a trustee, you should be responsible to your trust. So there are different conceptions, perhaps, of justice and responsibility to those that are under your protection. And I think we can safely say and translate those notions into a modern conception of rights.
So while there is a universal sort of acceptance in general of the notion of rights, but what about in their articulation, in the manner in which they can be articulated, interpreted, and enforced?
So this is an ongoing challenge. I think what is remarkable about today, the year 2000, is that a normative code of rights has essentially been universally accepted. This code is not being universally implemented. The fact, though, that it has been accepted even by governments who aren't even coming close to their implementation speaks to the moral imperative of them even looking like players that are responsible. And what this suggests to me, again, is another indicator of humankind's maturation. This notion that we do all have rights, that we have a responsibility towards each other, and that these rights are indivisible, and that questions of dignity and of honor and respect cannot be subsumed by other issues of material concern. These are the things that really have to concern us most. In practice, it will take time for these things to be implemented, but there's great progress being made, and a lot of it has to do with education and development. And
well, you just mentioned, with rights, you used the notion of responsibilities.
yes.
It frequently seems the problem in communities that we have often an exaggerated sense of our rights
Yes.
and not enough of a sense of our responsibilities. To what degree do you feel that faith can survive, not only survive, but sort of catalyze these commitments, these feelings of responsibility in a rapidly globalizing culture?
Faith has a paramount role to play. It gives individuals a framework for acting, for defining their purpose in life. If in fact you come to an understanding that we are not here by accident, that we have a purpose higher than the material circumstances that we find ourselves in, then the idea of service to others, of developing spiritual qualities and attributes such as kindness and trustworthiness and compassion and willingness to sacrifice for others comes into play. And the way that this actually becomes a powerful force, a motivational force that can bring about transformation, is really through recognition of our spiritual essence, putting God at the center of our lives. What this does, I think, is, I think for Baha'is, we would say that knowing that this life, this physical life, has a particular purpose, that we're here to develop spiritual qualities and characteristics in order to move forward in the next life. We believe that this is not the end, that we're undertaking an eternal journey towards God. And Baha'u'llah uses a very interesting analogy. He compares this life to the womb. And as the fetus in the womb develops arms and legs and eyes and organs, in order to function in this life effectively, this physical world, in some sense, is the matrix or the womb of eternity. We have to develop spiritual arms and legs in order to function in the next existence, which is essentially a spiritual reality. So with that perspective, what Baha'u'llah calls upon us to do, and what the great teachers of all the religions call upon us to do, is to follow that course of justice and peace and love and sacrifice and tolerance. This is ultimately what matters. When you think about it, the thing that touches me most is when I meet old friends, the connections that we make in life with others. These are the things that are most meaningful. We don't necessarily remember that we got 100 in our maths course in ninth grade, or we made so much money in 1 year, or personal accomplishments are fine, but the things that really define us and are most memorable to us are of what affects our heart, and this really has to go to our relationships with others. And
historically, these have been the guiding principles, the inspirations of faiths.
Yes.
And yet we have perhaps seen more conflict historically in the name of faith,
Sure.
and in the conflict and in the interface between faiths. Where have faiths failed, or
Yes.
have we failed the faiths?
Yes, I think your latter observation is probably the correct formulation of it. If you look at the actual utterances of the founders of the world's great religions, there is nothing to support the contentions that are convulsing various religious communities. There is no call for conflict or fanaticism or intolerance. These are corruption of true religious values. And so we have to be discriminating and scientific in our understanding of religion.
It's interesting you use the phrase, we have to be scientific. Certainly at the apparent level, science and religion have in some ways seemed, to say contradiction might be too extreme a phrase, but let's just say incompatible in many ways. They have seemed two different sensibilities. And sort of in India, Jawaharlal Nehru had called at independence for a revival of the scientific spirit. And that really implied that we didn't have enough of it and we had too much of religion. So in what ways do you see these two spirits or disciplines, both complementing and contradicting each other in some ways?
Yes. Well, here in India, one is struck immediately by the vital expressions of civilization here, the great architecture, which really was inspired by religion. And so, in some sense, Indian culture, Indian civilization, I think epitomizes the blending of science and religion to a degree that is unparalleled in the world. And I think that speaks to the point that, again, we must analyze by what we mean in terms of conflict between faith and reason, or science and religion. Yes, religious history has been characterized by intolerance and darkness and even suppression of free thinking and free thought and intellectual inquiry. And that's an imbalance, and that's a distortion of the religious spirit. What we saw with the Enlightenment was something very, very important and profound, and which, by the way, it's important to understand that the Western Enlightenment had its source with the Islamic civilization. I think those of us in the West fail to forget that and fail to remember that, rather. And so what the Enlightenment did is it really unshackled us from this sort of religious orthodoxy that gave us superstition and prevented us from moving forward. But while the Enlightenment sort of freed us intellectually, it also displaced the moral center that religion provided, and so we went too far the other way. Science provides a methodology. Science provides tools for understanding the universe, the reality, even the workings of society. Science provides mechanisms, methods for analyzing the world. Religion also is a system of knowledge. It provides understanding about our purpose. It is a source of knowledge and inspiration, of values, of insights, of energy that motivates and sustains people, that creates social cohesion.
I think there isn't a quarrel with the issues of the mind and the heart.
Yes.
But frequently in the way that the mind interprets the heart, or the heart interprets the mind, and these sort of express themselves in concrete theories that seem in contradiction. Mm-hmm. So you have a creation theory and you have a Darwinian theory, and what have you, and that is a source of
Yes, so again, this is a question of defining one's understanding what science is and what religion is. The Baha'i faith, in some sense, redefines science, redefines religion. The Baha'i teachings indicate that we must be scientific in our method, and that means even being scientific in our method in understanding religion. And so,
but scientific enough that if the logic of science contradicts the teaching, would you be willing to accept that?
Yes, that in some sense there's a point at which science cannot go. There's some barrier or some point at which the scientific process or methodology cannot take us. Science can tell us how things work. It can't tell you and I why we're here. And so they're complementary systems that allow us to understand and apprehend reality.
But yet there are, science will tell us
yes.
there are biochemical processes
yes.
or chemicals that can give us a sense of who we are, yes. or affect the way that we perceive reality. Mm-hmm. So, which is the real reality?
Well, I think that there's no conflict between the idea that physical and biological processes ultimately come from a set of laws that are divine in origin, that there's design behind everything. If you're suggesting, if I'm understanding you right, that are you talking about altering?
Well, I'm just saying that it is possible now, with the increasing understanding of the biochemistry of the brain,
yes.
to in some ways almost change human nature.
Yes. So this is a challenge of ethics and values for us. And one of the interesting things about the Baha'i Faith is that what it is saying is that we're not alone, that God continues to intervene in history. So the Baha'i Faith is one of the youngest religions in the world. It's 150 years old. It restates the basic principles of spiritual truths of the previous religions, but it brings a new set of ideas and methods for dealing with the challenges of today. So in some sense, there are questions that we have today that couldn't possibly be addressed 2,000 years ago. And so there are some very difficult questions about the application of technology and science that we'll have to very carefully weigh to alter the human being genetically is something very, very tricky and difficult, and will require much reflection.
How does the Baha'i Faith look at the future? Is there going to be a cataclysmic day of reckoning? Are these cycles of history where we'll go through sort of our ups and downs in civilizational terms? How do you see the future?
We view the future very optimistically, but with realism. The Baha'i understanding of history, again, is that it has been a process of releasing moral capacity. Yes, despite the misery and suffering that has characterized the human condition throughout history, there has still been an upward movement in a sociological perspective. We have gone from being organized, say, 10,000 years ago as sort of in clans and tribes and living primarily as agrarian units to the city-state, to wider organizations, to the nation-state. And now we are on the verge of global society and global civilization. We are linked in ways that are remarkable. I mean, I'm watching the news about what's happening in the United States here, and as if I'm at home. We are now linked in ways that never could be imagined before. What the future depends upon in terms of the realization of the age-long vision of peace and justice is really unleashing the spiritual resources that we have, the true resources, the longing that we have for understanding and harmony and equity. And what Baha'u'llah says is that we will get to that point where those conditions will finally be achieved. It all depends on us.
Well, Matthew Weinberg, thank you very much. It does depend on us. Thank you.